Everyone, this is Jamie Butcher. I'm glad to be with you all. I'm associate pastor here at First Presbyterian Church, and this is Practicing Care. And it's 2021. We've been through 2020, and we're looking for a sacred space to process some of the events of recent days of the pandemic and how that's a part of our faith journey. We really need some time to reflect and to set our intentions for the new year. So I am so excited today to be welcoming a professional to speak to us about the topic of advocacy. Dr. Catharina Chang is a professor at Georgia State University. She's published and presented in the areas of social justice and advocacy, multicultural counseling competence, privilege and oppression issues, and counseling implications related to Asian American and Korean American clients. She was the lead book editor for Professional Counseling Excellence Through Leadership and Advocacy, and the lead editor on a special issue on social justice for the Counselor Education and Supervision Journal. She's currently a trustee of the American Counseling Association Foundation and is a recipient of several awards from the ACA, which you can read about in her bio. Catharina is also known as Kat, a First Presbyterian member, long time with her family, and a woman of this congregation. So we are so excited to have you with us today. Kat, welcome.
So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, we wanted to start out on this topic of advocacy. Even the introduction, I've used some words that it might be helpful to unpack. So when we are looking at terms, looking at definitions, what do we mean when we talk about advocacy and injustice?
So I think I'd like to first start off with just defining social justice, because I think that's sort of the foundation of what we're really talking about. And when we talk about social justice, what we're talking about is that we recognize that the impact of oppression, of privilege, and discrimination has on individuals. And it's the idea of fairness and equity within a society. So when we talk about social justice, it's the idea that we believe that within a society, each individual has the right to equitable treatment. And so then the idea of social injustice is that the distribution of rewards and resources, finances are unequal. And so the way that injustice looks like is it looks like poverty. It looks like a lack of health care, unsafe environment, laws that target a specific population. It manifests itself in looking at stricter applications of laws to one group versus another group. And so if you have justice on one end, which is you have the fair, equitable treatment, you have injustice on the other end where you have distributions which are unequal. And the unequal is based on things that could be race, gender, sexual identity, sexual orientation, things that are not, I would say, things that a person is inherently a part of their identity. It's not something they did, it's not a punishment, it's just injustice because of who they are.
That's really helpful, thank you. Brings it down to very concrete information that we can relate to and understand. So thank you for that. When we talk about advocacy, and we're going to be looking at specifically advocacy as a form of self-care, as something that's good for us, as well as for other folks. But what do we mean when we say advocacy?
So when we talk about advocacy, what we're talking about is any action that you take that supports or argues on behalf of somebody else. And so advocacy is really something that you do for somebody else, for some other group. Now, I will say within the literature, they've sort of broken down advocacy into three main things. You can talk about self-advocacy, because sometimes we do have to advocate for ourselves. And so we become that other person that you are supporting. And Caitlin, who in the other video that I watched, did a really good job talking about self-advocacy. The other two aspects of advocacy is individual advocacy. And that's when you stand beside someone who you believe has been treated unfairly. And so under individual advocacy, you are supporting someone else. Then there's also systemic advocacy. And this is sort of the big A. When I think about advocacy, I think of little a advocacy and big A advocacy. And big A advocacy is when you want to make systemic changes, when you want to change policies, rules, laws at the local, state, national level that seem unjust and unfair. And so I think for most of us, the big A, systemic change, seems scary. Excuse me, but what we can do is we can focus on the little a advocacy, where we focus on either taking care of ourselves or helping somebody else at the individual level.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Kat. I think that is something that I haven't heard unpacked so carefully, and it is very invitational, especially if the big A feels a little scary. It just is helpful to hear a professional say that that little a is something we can easily focus on and still be speaking up for other folks. So thank you. You know, this curriculum is about 2020, or about this particular season of our lives together, where we have really seen some injustice highlighted. And so one of the things that we've seen with this unveiling of injustice is an increase in advocacy and awareness. But could you just walk us through what we've been going through these past few months how has this COVID season highlighted injustice, increased advocacy, made us more aware? Any thoughts you have about that would be great.
Right. And I think, 2020 has been an unprecedented year. And a lot of times we talk about 2020 as being a double pandemic. It's not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also has been a rally cry for racism. And what you've seen is increased attacks on Black African-American communities. You've seen increased attacks and discrimination against the Asian population. You have some people calling it the Chinese flu or the Asian peril. And so what the pandemic has done is that it has highlighted cracks within our society about what injustices actually do exist. And so these things existed before the pandemic, excuse me. But I think that because of the pandemic and because of increased tension within our healthcare system, what we've noticed is that the COVID-19 has disproportionately influenced Black Americans, Latinx Americans, vulnerable populations. And part of that is due to, if you think about during COVID, what did they tell us to do? They told us to work from home. They told us to distance ourselves, to wear masks. If you stop and think about it, these are all luxuries that we have. I'm grateful I have a job. I haven't been in my office since March. I'm getting my same paycheck. I'm working from home. Merrill, my husband, he hasn't been in his office since March either. He's working from home. We have the luxury of doing that. Many people who have a different socioeconomic status, different job market, don't have that opportunity, that luxury. And so what the pandemic has demonstrated is that those who are most vulnerable in our society are also being re-traumatized and have a bigger burden to carry. And they have fewer financial resources, fewer savings, and fewer employment benefits. Georgia State, where I work, was wonderful. They said, hey, you all work from home, let us know. They gave us tech support. I had everything I needed to transition from office work to home work. If you have work for an employer that doesn't have that sort of support, you either go to work, expose yourself to COVID, become sick, or you lose your job. And so I think the pandemic just helped heighten that racial injustice does occur. The other thing it did, and this is, I think, the positive, trying to look at gratitude and thinking for, what positive thing can we think about this? We have a lot of people at home. We have more people who are have free time. And so they're doing a lot more reading on social media. And so some people may not have been as aware of social injustice. Now that they're at home, they have more time, they're actually reading more about it. And so the interesting thing about COVID is that you have seen an increase in advocacy work. You've seen an increase in people blogging, writing, talking, having discussions about the importance of being advocates. And then you've also seen an increase in financial contributions to different organizations that do social justice work. And so even though 2020 was a horrible year in terms of the pandemic, highlighting racial injustices, it also has been somewhat hopeful in that more people have lent their voice to increasing social justice work.
That's awesome. Thank you for helping unpack that. It's something that we've been living through and experiencing. And I would make a bet that some of the women who are going to be hearing this and responding to this have just thought of themselves as advocates in this season. Maybe it's because they sent a check to an organization and hadn't even thought of that as being an advocacy practice. But you're right, that's really good to think about that and just highlight how maybe there is something from this season that can be hopeful, that we can move forward with with resources differently distributed in a way, or at least supporting organizations that are working toward that. So thank you. Thank you. Another question, we are talking about in this curriculum, practicing care for ourselves using this passage from John, from God, but from the Gospel of John, where we hear that we are called to love other people, really rooted in this idea that God loves us first. And so from that love, we can share love and do the hard work of love and caring for other people equitably and with justice. So thinking about that call and thinking about how that is an expression of love for ourselves that's grounded in God, how do you think about advocacy as actually a form of caring for yourself? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, as humans, we are social beings. We are social creatures. We like to be in community, some more than others, but for the most part, we are social beings. And so with that in mind, I think that we become our best self when we're with others, and we can not only take care of ourselves, but then take care of others around us. And so when I think about advocacy as self-care, yes, you want to self-advocate, do some self-care practices. But one way to also take care of yourself is to be aware of those who are around us and be aware of issues that are important to us and to engage in those types of activities. Because, as I think about counseling, as I think about working with clients, people are most happy when they can engage in something that is meaningful. And typically that meaningfulness involves people other than themselves. And so from an Adlerian, which is a counseling theory, you talk about this idea of social interest, is people experience greater self-care, self-wellness if they can have social interest. And that social interest involves other people. And so advocacy as care means that we take care of ourselves, but we also take care of others. Excuse me.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to be said, I think, for the church under that definition, or faith communities as being these seats of meaning and connection with others. So we are well situated to be caring for others and from our congregation or in our congregation, from our sacred scriptures. And a part of that is caring for ourselves or knowing that the benefits of those connections and just experiencing that for ourselves and working for that for others. So that's interesting. I always think it's very interesting when we can see how things are showing up in the secular world, and then also, in the faith community, how we translate those in ways. So that's really good. I did have one more question, but it's back to the definitions, and it's kind of thinking about some of the things we've seen during COVID. And that is, how do you explain a difference between advocacy and activism?
Right. So those are two terms I think that many people use interchangeably. And from my perspective, there's a nuanced difference. Activism is to act in solving a political or social issue. Whereas advocacy, for me to be an advocate, to be a true advocate, you listen first. Because as an advocate, if you are standing beside somebody else, if you're there to support and argue on behalf of somebody else, you have to first listen. You have to first listen and be compassionate. And with that listening and compassion gives you an understanding of what that person or that community needs. And so then as an advocate, you may then go on to action and speak up for injustices, but the first part is listening. Whereas as an activist, you take action first and you are acting against some sort of political or social issue. Does that make sense? So it's confusing because I do think in the literature and especially in just general newspapers, newsletters, social media, they are used interchangeably. But I think that from my perspective, they're not the same thing. They're definitely related and oftentimes overlap. However, a true advocate is someone who listens and acts out of compassion, whereas an activist is someone who acts sometimes rationally, sometimes irrationally. But an activist doesn't necessarily act on behalf of somebody else, whereas an advocate does act on behalf of somebody else.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I remember some people listening to this may have heard this story before, but I think it was so impactful to me. When I was in CPE, clinical pastoral education and chaplaincy in the VA health system in East Tennessee, we'd go into these rooms and we'd sit beside these soldiers who were sick, dying, and we'd come away, these young seminarians come back to our group and say to the supervisor, you know, I didn't do anything. What am I doing there? I just said a prayer and I listened to a story and I was just listening. And he said, James Pollard, he said, it's never just listening. If you are hearing a story that hasn't been shared before, if you're offering your compassion and a space for that, it is justice listening. So I think that's a really helpful reminder, especially in a season where, you know, change is needed, action is needed, and a faith tradition that calls for action as well, calls for works, but also just to be reminded of the real holiness, of the real importance of listening and caring for another. And from that standpoint, speaking up as an advocate. That's really helpful. Thank you for just honoring that and reminding us to draw attention to that.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, I think listening is such a powerful tool. And so listening can be a form of advocacy, is having somebody tell their story to you.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. So thank you, Kat. Is there anything that we didn't cover, or anything you just wanted to add that you want to make sure we're thinking about on this topic or in this time?
No, but I would like to share one of my favorite quotes, because when I think about doing advocacy as care, doing social justice work, I always go back to Martin Luther King Jr. and some of his writings. And in terms of thinking about this topic particularly, this is the quote I think is most relevant. So it's, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so being mindful of that, we are part of a community. And so even though things are happening outside of your bubble, don't think it doesn't impact you in some way. And conversely, you know, by helping one person, you can help a society. And so just being mindful of the power of one, I think.
Wow, thank you so much, Kat. That's very helpful, very invitational, and also just what we needed to hear today. So thank you again for speaking to us, and we'll see you at church sometime in the near future.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.